Everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do a viewer questions show. So we've got about a month and a half's worth of questions, I think, to catch up on, and well, let's get underway. So the first one comes from King Hunter, who asks about a game that was played, also it's been about a month, it was played in the Greek Team Championship. It was played that day. And he says there's an interesting endgame, rook ending arising at move 33, and he'd like me to explain some of the moves and ideas, and he also has a particular question about one specific move. So this was Nicolaidis against Lupulescu, and we start here. So black has just played e takes a knight on f3, and material is even, but clearly black is much better here, or at least I should say black has clearly whatever chances there are to be had in this position. Whether he's objectively better or not remains to be seen. So, the big problem for white, obviously, is his king. His king is just in terrible shape here. I mean, it's practically mated. So, and the other thing is that there's not really even any obvious way for him to get out of this box. So, how is the white king going to survive this? Well, the next few moves I think are useful. Rook takes b6, rook a3. And now here in the game, Nicolaidis played rook from 6 to b5. And after king to e6, takes, rook to b5 check, king to e4, played rook to b4 check. And this is a mistake. But let me go back even to here, to this position after rook takes b6, rook a3, and suggest that even rook 6 to b4 is pretty good. The problem for black is that he can't really make anything happen on the second rank. If he plays, for instance, rook to a2, then, sorry, not this rook comes up, and black's not getting anywhere. I mean, he can check, white simply retreats. So after rook 6 to b4, I don't see anything really that he can do with his king either, or to make any kind of pawn breakthrough. So probably he just has to play rook to a5, and after something like rook 1 to b2, and this rook exchange, then king to d2, I think white is actually pretty well set up. So the king's off the back rank, all the pawns are on one side of the board, and his f-pawn is okay, because if black were to play something like rook to a1, white can probably just play e4, and that allows him to play king e3 next, where the pawn on f2 is, of course, more than adequately guarded, and the black f3 pawn is going to drop. Now, of course, black can defend it in various ways. He could play his rook back to a3, he could play h5, but in either case, it's going to keep white's h-pawn alive and kicking. So the point is, all right, let's say h5, rook to b3, and okay, now if rook to h1 we just take, and if g4, well, white's taking, and so there's no longer an h-pawn to be lost. So it's pretty hard to see how white really will get in any trouble here. Probably just retreating to b2 should be quite safe enough, followed by king to e3 and king f4. Okay. So back to the game. Rook 6 to b5, king e6, takes, rook b5 check, king e4. And here I think white makes another inaccuracy. He plays rook to b4 check, which just invites the black king in. Now, it's not quite as bad as it seems after rook to d4 check, king c3. I mean, there's no immediate mate. I mean, the rook can always drop back to d1, but this really isn't something that white should have allowed. So it's much better, I think, here just to play the obvious a5. Occasionally, obvious moves are good moves. So, what does black do? If he plays king to d3, well, rook to d5 check, no big deal. And then, well, depending on what he does, he'll either release the mating net or allow white to get even more active with his rook. So let's say rook a1 check, king d2, rook a2, king e1. Okay, we can try this. This gets nowhere. And after king d3, as I said, rook to d5 check, and black is not making progress here. So I think that white should be drawing here. This should be satisfactory. Okay, well, in the game, check here, rook d4 check, king c3. And, okay, the basic idea for black now is to play rook a1 check, which forces rook to d1, and then rook takes a4, and then black can kind of take it from there and see what he can get. You know, the thing about a position like this is that it doesn't really matter if it's a win or a draw as far as practically the practical aspect of the game goes. you just play, you try, you do this, you do that. If it works, great, you win. If it doesn't, well, it's a draw and you did your best. So it's, the evaluation is not really so important. Okay, well, what does white do? Now, white would like to trade pawns, especially, as I mentioned before, this potentially weak h-pawn. The problem is that h4 just creates a weakness, because after gh4, white can't play rook takes h4 because he gets mated. So g takes h4, rook a1 check, and then rook a4, and the h-pawn is going to drop. And there it goes. Now, if he tries to be active with rook to d6, well, the problem now is that he goes into a lost king and pawn ending. And black is getting the opposition. So if king c1, king e2, obviously, and if king e1, it's very important to recognize this kind of pattern, that even though the white king is going to hang around his pawns, he's just going to get kind of squeezed out like toothpaste from a tube here, as black just kind of keeps pushing up on the tube, and finally the white king has to kind of squirt out away from the pawns, out of the tube, and well, then the tube gets devoured. So we end up changing our metaphor. Anyway, white is losing here. So h4, while in principle it would be nice to get rid of the pawn, to swap off a pair of pawns, it's not a successful idea here. Okay, so g4, and black regains the pawn. All right. So, is it winning yet? Who knows? Doesn't matter. Got to keep going from here. All right, so white plays this check. And for quite a while, black just tacks around, and it's absolutely fine. There's nothing that white can really do to him. So he just kind of moves around. He's probably gaining time on the clock. I imagine that this event was using an increment. So it was I don't know if it was, it could either be that they were playing with an increment, or they needed to get to the next time control and move 60. Whatever the case, it's perfectly reasonable for black to kind of torture white, just move around a little bit, and wait for a mistake. And if one doesn't come, well, then you figure out what to do. And here, finally, after doing nothing for about 17, 18 moves, black springs into action with the very logical h5. So this makes sense. If white does nothing, well, black is going to just win a pawn, just take twice on g4. And if white takes, well, then both of his h-pawns are weak, and it looks like this should be really bad. So you might want to try to figure out how white should defend here. I think this might be his last chance to hold the game. So I think he can draw here with best play. The way to do it is paradoxically by making this capture. Let me drag this over so you guys can't get hints in the future here, unintentional hints. So g takes h5, rook h4. And now, what does white do? The only way to handle this is by bringing the king over now. King f1 and king g1. So now there's no back rank mate to worry about. And after rook to d6, it turns out that, well, black is just really has no prospects here. If he gives up the pawn, it's a dead draw. But after rook h6, e4, and the simple threat of e5 is going to regain the pawn. Black just holds the game. Well, okay, that's actually, yeah, no, that is right, because I was thinking rook h4 here, rook e4. But even if there wasn't rook takes f3, this would still be a draw. But the fact that there is rook f3 makes it even easier. Okay, well, in the game, white threw in this check first, and this loses, surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly. So takes rook h4, and now the black king is closer to white's structure, also closer to coming back to defending his own pawns. And there's no e4 this time. So remember, look at the variation before with g takes h5. So rook h4, here, takes, rook d6. Rook h6, e4. Well, if the white rook is on c6 and the black king is on d3, that doesn't exist. And black can just play king to e4, king f5, and move the rook away, at worst. So the game version is just lost. So let's move ahead to the point where it was thought maybe white had something better. By the way, here another try for white is rook to d4 check. So I think something like this is probably a better defensive try for white, but I think it's losing as well. Okay, rook f6. And actually, yeah, here black makes a mistake. I don't think it quite costs him the win, but it definitely makes it a lot tougher. So once again, you should try to figure out what you should do here. Well, black decided to make the obvious move, and he grabbed this pawn on h5. And I see it doesn't take, so I tried moving it over. It's back there. Anyway, rook h5 is a mistake, and we'll see why later on. But this idea is actually much simpler. Rook h1, and then rook f1, winning the pawn. White can try to either bother the black king and push him back, or try pushing his h-pawn. Neither seems to be good enough to hold. So for instance, h6. And these two connected passed pawns are far more dangerous than whatever white has. I mean, also white's king is stuck on the back rank. His pawns are split. His pawns are further advanced, collectively that is. So it's not even remotely surprising that black is winning. He can even give up this f-pawn, because check and g2 with a basic win. Okay, so after rook e6 check instead of h6, king f5, rook a6, well, we take rook f1, e4, king to g4, and again, white's winning. Don't think we really need to look at all the variations, so just suffice it to say that with black's much better king, his very well protected passers, and the fact that it's quite easy to stop the white passers for now, black is winning. So back to the game. After rook f6, rook takes h5 happened, and here the question is, well, what about rook to a6? Does this draw? I don't think it quite manages to draw, but it is a better idea for sure, and it makes the win difficult. The basic point is that on rook h1 check and then rook f1, white plays rook to a4 check, and well, wherever the king goes, it's going to be okay for white. So I think king e5 is maybe best, check, and then e4, and king e3. And the problem is rook f1, rook f5 check. So the f-pawn drops, and that's just a dead draw. But where else could the black king have gone? I mean, if he goes to e6, we just take on g5, and it's a dead draw. So there's nothing there. So from here, though, black has a much better move than rook h1, and it's king f5. Very subtle move. So we're deactivating our king, but the reason we're doing it is, well, we need to get the king to g2, or else to force a lot of concessions from white before that. Okay, so what does white do now? Well, the best move may be, strangely enough, e4 check. So that way, if the king goes to g4, the e-pawn becomes a force in its own right. So king e4, rook a5. Rook h1, king d2, g4, check here, check, check. Okay, now we don't want to keep checking him because he'll go to h4 and h3 and g2. So rook a8, so that way king h4 is impossible. But now black has this neat little maneuver. Rook h5, king h4, rook h7. He could have actually gone to h7 in the first place, but it's going to come to the same thing. So now, again, the threat is to play rook f7 check and then king h3. Let me draw this on the board. And once the king's on g2, it's just over. So rook a1 attempts to stop this, but the problem is it really doesn't. Okay, rook to g1 stops king to g2. But now white's in a slight zugzwang here. We play rook to f8. And, well, here there's some problems. If king to e4, then king h4, and king g5. And, okay, rook e8 check, rook e2 is next. So the white rook is in the worst possible position here. If he plays rook to a1, well, of course, king g2. So can't do that. If rook to g3 check, then king h4, and again, king g5. We push the white king away, and the rook comes into e2, and now king f4 followed by g3 wins the game. So this is winning even after best play, but it's much more challenging. Instead of rook a6, white played rook f8, and then it was kind of easy. Rook check, rook f1, and this time white has no good defense. So it's check, another check, and the only thing black has to be minutely careful about is that he doesn't allow the white rook to move someplace where it attacks something good. But here, I mean, even if, I don't know, let's say black played king f2, rook to g8, rook e7, rook g5, well, that's still a win for black, so it doesn't really matter. But g4 is certainly the most effective move, and white resigned here. Okay, on to the next question. This is from Prospero, who says, "Hi Dennis, there's a famous endgame between Capablanca and Janowski that Paul Benko discussed in one of his Chess Life columns some years ago. I can't remember the details, but my impression is that Capablanca's technique was seen as innovative, original, and not widely understood at the time it was played. Subsequently, it became a part of every Grandmaster's endgame arsenal, and I believe Fischer even played a game once where he employed knowledge of the Capablanca ending to nail down the win. In a somewhat ironic twist, I believe Benko showed that Janowski resigned prematurely in the original game. Are you familiar with this ending? If so, would you discuss its provenance and explain the techniques so we amateurs might add it to our toolbox? Thanks." Well, yeah, I know the endgame exactly that you're referring to, although I think you might be confusing several things here. So I'm not sure that Capablanca's technique in this ending was considered overly original. It was good technique for the most part, but I'm wondering if you're maybe confusing that bit of the praise for Capablanca with another game he played against Janowski where it wasn't in the endgame. So there are three games we need to take a look at here to get the full picture, I think, to get the full story of what we're discussing. So both of the Capablanca-Janowski games were from New York in 1916, the same event. In this game, the end game, Capablanca had white, and the ending begins here. Okay, so white has just played bishop takes d6, so they just swapped rooks. And all right, white's up a pawn, and it's not that he's going to promote the g-pawn. What he wants to do is use the g-pawn to tie down the black king. The white king is going to come over and eventually win the b-pawn, and hopefully white will win the race to to be able to keep the black king out and promote his pawn. So let's see how things go. So for a while, all the moves are pretty obvious. Okay, bishop to e3. All right, so g5. And black doesn't want to give ground, but king f4, so it's a nice idea. He's going to bring his king around, and maybe this is what Benko was referring to, if this is the game of which that praise was intended. So what Capablanca does is he kind of swishes his king around here. If he can't break through on this side, he's going to come around with his king to h7, or h5, excuse me, drive the black king back, and then swing his king back around towards the queen side. So king f4, king g4, king h5. Okay, the black king retreats. Now king to h6. All right, so the king has to go to g8. Otherwise, king h7, g6, bishop h6, g7, and then g8 queen. Of course, black will have to sacrifice his bishop, and then it's just a very easy win. So the king has to go to g8. We can go back to here, too, and see, okay. Well, he's already too late. I mean, in this position. I mean, if he wants to go to f7 to cover g6, well, then he's letting the white king come in this way. So he can only start to move back from here, but then he's too late. All right, so going forward, king g8, bishop to b6. This is also a nice little move, trying to keep the pawn as far back as possible so that he can win it. And it's on a light square, of course, so the black bishop can't defend it. But Janowski plays pretty well here. So bishop to c3, bishop to d2. So he's going to kind of fix the bishop onto the white pawn, forcing it to go to g6, and then by putting it on g6, the black king can attack it when white's king runs away, and white's bishop can't defend it. So that's going to force white's bishop to retreat, and then black will be able to bring his pawn up to b4 at a useful moment. Well, we'll see the point of that soon. King f6, bishop c3, king e6, bishop back to d2. So there, he's forced it. All right, so now if king to g7, then king f5 and bishop to d4. So he just plays this, king d5, and now, well, king g7 is impossible because check, and this is just dead won. So Janowski plays bishop to d2, so he's threatening king to g7 again. And now, well, that would be good enough to draw. So bishop to d4, and now the pawn can move. So b5. And the point is, okay, after, let's say, king to c5, b4. And this means that white is going to have to finally commit. See, he wants his bishop on d4, cutting the black king off. And so at some point he's going to have to get it off that diagonal to win the pawn. And so it's, of course, better for black, much better, that the pawn is all the way back on b3. I mean, the further up the pawn would be, the worse it would be for black, because black needs time to get his king back to the defense. So here it's a draw. King c4, bishop e1, bishop c5, king g7, takes, bishop g3. So this is why it's important for the pawn to be on a light square, so the bishop from b4 can't move to defend it. Okay, check here, b4, king f7, b5, bishop to c7, and it's a draw. The black king is there in plenty of time. So instead of king to c5, Capablanca continues to try to tack around here. b4, bishop b3, king d3, and again, if king g7, there's bishop to d4. So bishop to e1, bishop d2, bishop f2, and again, if king c4, king g7 is a draw, or bishop b4, king g7 is a draw. So he tries to tack around a little bit more, and it actually encouraged a mistake, although Capablanca himself failed to take advantage. So here, black should play king to g7, and on king f5, bishop c5, and eventually, well, not eventually, but white is going to have to bring his king back to the queen side again. Instead, he played bishop to c5, and we'll see that it was very subtle, but it was a mistake. Bishop to e7, king c4, king g7 takes, bishop d8, and here Capablanca made a mistake. So he could have forced a win at this point. It's not obvious, but it's there. Janowski clearly didn't see the point either, as we'll see. But the one winning move here is bishop to d2. Now, the point of this is far from obvious, so let's come back, see what happened in the game. So in the game, Capablanca played bishop to c3 check, king takes g6, b4, king f5, and now king to d5. And here Janowski very cleverly resigned. It looks, like a normal kind of decision. I mean, the king is cut off, can't get back to the pawn, and so white slowly but surely will be able to advance the pawn without allowing black to trade his bishop off for it, and thereby win. However, black is drawing here, and here's the reason why he's drawing. He's able to come with his king to the backside of the pawn, and remarkably, this idea saves the draw. And we can already see now. Okay, king f4 is the drawing move, and this is why, going back a few moves, the winning move was bishop to d2. So the point is, in this position, there's no king f4, so the king has to go one square further away to come around behind the pawn, and it's going to be too late. b5, king f3, king c6, king e4, and now, well, if you want to torture yourself, it's good torture, but it's very difficult. How does white win in this position? Okay, the answer, and it's very instructive. What he needs to do is put his king on a6 and play bishop to a5. So the answer is king to b7. It's the only winning move, I think. King d3, bishop b1. Actually, it may not be the only winning move, but it's something you'll have to play either that move or the next move, and it's the key idea. King c4, king a6. Now, if black's king were already on a4, so it's black's move here. He's playing king to b3. Remember, he lost a tempo in this variation, so he could play king a4 here with that extra tempo and draw. But he's one move too late here. And now white wins. So, back to the game. King d5, Janowski resigned, but king f4 draws. Bishop to d4, king f3, b5, king e2, king c6, king to d3, bishop b6, bishop g5, and we just switch diagonals. So white cuts off that diagonal, we go to this one. And now, for instance, if bishop to d6, king c4, bishop c7, bishop f2 here, and we just go to a neutral spot and switch back to this diagonal. Okay, now that was the analysis that I had done, but I looked this position up in Dvoretzky's Endgame Manual, and a player named Isler, and himself as well, found some really neat variations from here. So white can be a bit more tricky with the move king to d5. And now black has to be exceptionally careful to hold the game. If he continues the path of the king to the queen side, then he loses. King c3, bishop d6. And now if king to b3, bishop c5, king a4, king c6. And white wins. So the pawn gets to b6. If the pawn can get to b6 in this situation, it's over. So let's say bishop to d6. Well, king c6, bishop to d8, bishop e3, bishop c5, and of course the pawn goes. So bishop d8, bishop c7, and again, there goes the pawn. And just to show you how to finish it, one simple way is like this. Game over. So after king to d5, this remarkable retreat, black has to be exceptionally accurate here. And the only move is bishop to d2, which is a great move. And the idea is that on b6, which is normally just game over, black has bishop to a5, which is fantastic. So b7, bishop takes c7. So white can try bishop to d8, though, which is clever. Because now the idea is after b6, bishop a5, b7, and there's no bishop to c7 there. So black again has to be careful. If he plays bishop to e1, then b6, and that just shows you the idea that I mentioned. But bishop to e3, switching back to this diagonal, holds. So again, bishop c7, bishop d2, king c6, bishop e3. And okay, if bishop d6, king c4, we saw this one already. And if king to b7, king c4, king a6. And here black has to find one last idea to hold the game. All right, if you play bishop to f2, just marking time, you lose. Bishop e6, bishop e3, and now bishop to d2 followed by bishop a5 wins. Okay, so the choice is between king b3 and king b4, and they look like they should be exactly the same thing, but they're not. King to b4 will lose. Here's why. Bishop to b6, bishop g5, and bishop a5 is check, so the pawn goes, and it's a win. So king to b3 is the only move. Bishop to b6, bishop g5, bishop f2, bishop to d8, bishop to e1, and white's just about to play bishop to a5, but king to a4 shuts the door on white's tries, and now it's just an easy draw. All right, so that's it's an easy draw right now, but getting to this was not easy. And anyway, so the key idea, and really the neat thing, is this idea of the king going behind the pawn and kind of catching the train from the back. All right. Now, as I said, or as you mentioned, there's a Fischer game, but you're slightly confused. It was in fact Fischer who knew about this and drew using that knowledge. So the game was against Mark Taimanov, played in Buenos Aires in 1960. Fischer had black here. And let me quote from Taimanov. So this is from, or I'm quoting this from The Russians versus Fischer. And here's what Taimanov had to say. My colleagues bet me, Bobby can't save himself. It's impossible. It needs such accuracy. And indeed, when the game was resumed, so let me break in here, the game was adjourned several moves before this point. So there were still rooks and queens on the board at the point where the game was stopped. And, okay, this position that we're looking at now is just after queens got traded. So there you go. And, okay, so back to the Taimanov quote. Indeed, when the game was resumed, one sensed that it was hard for Fischer to find the correct decisions and that he was teetering on the edge of an abyss. But then the critical, most important position was reached, and Bobby began playing quickly and faultlessly like a machine. He produced 15 almost forced moves within a minute. A draw became inevitable, and stunned by such a finale, I asked, Bobby, how did you manage to find the saving path and do it so quickly? I didn't have to do any thinking, Fischer replied, beaming. 7 years ago, your magazine, Schachmatny VSSR, Chesney USSR, published a detailed analysis of this endgame by Averbach, and I was very familiar with all the variations. So there you see the benefit of studying. All right, well, we're not in this Capablanca-Janowski ending yet, but we'll get there pretty soon. So Fischer starts with bishop to g3, which is very nice, and then d3. So the white king is locked in here, for starters. Bishop to b4, king d7, bishop e1, bishop f4. So now he's threatening d2. So he's not making it easy. And finally, okay, white manages to crawl his king off the back, but he's had to make some concessions. He's going to lose the pawn on g6 in due course. So there it goes. Okay, of course, white is going to win the pawn on d3. This was a good move, by the way, king h5, because if g4, king h4. So white has to move with the king, and now the black king gets to perch on this excellent square. So very good play so far, and Fischer is making it as annoying as possible for white to get his ideal kind of setup. Anyway, sooner or later it will arise, So now we've got that. White's forced the pawn onto the dark square there. And black, of course, is going to keep his king near the g-pawn, ready to take. Okay, so there we go. And so again, we've reached this ending, and we know that the basic idea is for the black king to come behind the pawn. So bishop c3, bishop to d6. Of course, we make white work for every single advance of that pawn. Here, here, bishop d4, bishop to b4, of course, here. And now black has to be careful. If he plays bishop to d6, he loses. Bishop c5, b4, and white's a tempo too fast. So after king to c4, bishop to a5 was the right move. Okay, if king d5, we go back, and on b5, king e4. And there you go. You see again, the king sneaks around the backside. King c6, king c4. Another nice little move there. And it was quite clear to time it off at this point that Fischer knew exactly what he was doing. And it's this is actually a very well-known draw. All right, so this is excuse me, the Fischer example. So he used his knowledge of that endgame to hold it, but it wasn't Capablanca's technique. It was later analysis, and it was taking up the Janowski side of the equation. Now, I was just thinking that when you were talking about Capablanca being praised for his originality, there was another game, again played against Janowski, in that 1916 tournament. And, okay, so here's that game. Capablanca was black. And now we get to the moment that really excited annotators, where Capablanca played bishop to d7 and then e6, which looks insane. So his bishop looks active on f5, so what does he do? He sticks it back into the pocket here, and then he shuts it in. And of course, wastes the tempo to do so. The idea, we'll see in the game, it works out very nicely. He basically wants to put the pawn on b5 to support a knight on c4. To do that, of course, the bishop has to be there to protect the pawn. But while it's not a bad idea, it certainly wasn't some idea that led to some kind of a forced win. So a lot of the early annotation of this game was really quite superficial and just mistaken. Janowski was just fine and made a poor decision later on. So here, after e4, king f7, if Janowski simply plays e takes f5, and then f4 followed by knight f3, and when he wants to, knight e5, white should have really practically no losing chances at all. It should just be very equal. Maybe he can even have chances for an edge, in fact, with after knight f3 playing bishop to b4 and trying to swap off the dark square bishop, put his rook on e1 and so on. So there could even be some situations where he could even have an edge here. So it's only after e5, which was a big positional mistake, that Janowski gets in trouble. And so from here on out, Capablanca looks like a genius with his bishop to d7 idea. So now it's just going to be a minority attack. White's minor pieces are terrible. I mean, e5 is just a huge mistake. I mean, it kills his knight, kills his rooks, and even makes his bishop worse. So from here, it's just one-way traffic. Capablanca is playing on both sides, giving him worries all over the place. So he's got to worry about b4, he's got to worry about the g file. It's just too much. Okay, so now he's just holding on the king side, but now breakthrough. So there's bishop a4, the bishop's going to go to c2, and then to e4, and it's just all over. Okay, so the bishop's clogging up the g file, but it's not going to stay. And that's it. So no meaningful discovered checks, and okay, he struggles on for a few more moves, but there's really no hope here. And yeah, he's in danger of simply getting mated by rook a3. And if king g3, rook a3, king h4, rook h2 is mate. So Janowski resigned here. All right, so a very nice game by Capablanca, but that early stage, it was an interesting idea, but it wasn't some brilliant winning plan that led to a forced win. Okay, so let's move on to another question or set of questions. This is from Andishmond. It's an A player. Says, "Hi Dennis, I just watched your analysis of the game Reshevsky-Viganian. That was a French defense where Viganian sacrificed quite a bit of material, drove Reshevsky's king out into the open, and won quite nicely." So he says, "And I remembered another famous king march, this time a successful one. The game Karpov-Alexander Zaitsev from the Soviet Championship in 1970, or actually it was from the Russian Championship, I think, not the Soviet Championship, is a real miracle. I mean, just look at that king standing on e4 like it's no big deal." So he asks if I could possibly analyze it. Well, I'm not going to analyze the whole game, but I will take a look at the kind of critical moment where the king is out there in the open. So it was a Caro-Kann. Karpov had white back in the good old days when he played e4 and said that the Caro-Kann was a depressing opening. Of course, now he doesn't play e4 and he plays the Caro-Kann. All right, so here I believe he said that he was inspired by, I think it was Tal, with this kingside pawn advance. And, well, in an un-Tal-like fashion, well, it's sort of, he misplays it, so he doesn't have that Tal feeling for the initiative maybe, but then he goes into these crazy complications and outwits his opponent, so I guess that was Tal-like as well. Anyway, all these moves are a bit weak. So h5 is not best, f3 is not best, this check isn't best. And finally, when we get to this position, material is even at the moment, but Karpov is in terrible trouble here. So he's not going to castle. He has pretty bad development. His king obviously is going to be very exposed. Probably his best move here is king to d2 instead of e2. But his position's awful here. So I mean, it's just a matter of which awful position he wants. So he chose this one, king e2, d3, and again probably king to d2 is the better choice, but still it's a lousy position here. His pawns on the king side are all weak. He has no development to speak of, and his king is terrible. Queen g5 check is a threat. Okay, but in the game he played king to e3, and here black to move I think is winning, not some kind of combination winning. So, you don't have to look for some kind of brilliancy prize that ends the game in a forced mate. But see if you can figure out how black should best handle the complications. Well, in the game, Zaitsev tried queen to f6, and this was actually a mistake. He's still better after it, but it's not the best move. The best move was just to play king takes f7. And now, well, white's a piece down, so he needs to capture the bishop on e4. We can look at each capture. If f takes e4, then knight e5. And black has a big threat here. He's threatening just to play queen g5 check. King d4 is the only move. Bishop f2, and that's checkmate. So white obviously has to do something about this. Bishop takes d3 is a pretty natural something. So queen g5 check. Again, king d4, bishop f2 is mate next move. So king e2, but then just queen g4 and rook h to d8. And it's time to set up the pieces for the next game. I mean, white is just 100% lost here. Okay. So f takes e4 doesn't work. Well, how about king takes e4? This looks crazy, but you never know. Well, knight f6, knight to d5. So it's funny, we're driving the king back, but black is coordinating his forces to make use of this great d-pawn. Of course, white can't take the pawn on d3. I mean, he just gets himself mated. King d3, not mated, but he loses his queen. Knight c7 check. So king d2, bishop f4. All right, now if king to d1, d2. That's death. Because if bishop takes d2, then knight c3, and that's mate. But king to e1 is only marginally better. Takes, queen g5, threatening to take the rook, and also threatening d2. Not much fun there. So rook to b1, check. And now, okay, it's not necessary, but rook a to d8 is quite strong, protecting the pawn indirectly. And of course, white also has to worry about queen takes f3 check. Also, maybe has to worry about d2 and queen e1. I mean, it's just too much. For rook h2, queen g1 is winning. So it's just hopeless. Black would win pretty straightforwardly with king takes f7. Instead, queen f6 happened, and now Karpov made a fantastic move, king takes e4. And it looks ridiculous, but he's just going to take everything in sight. I mean, his king, this bishop on e4 is very strong, and black is threatening queen takes f3 after all. So, well, let's get rid of this thing. The problem is f takes e4, I think, is not working. Let me see. What's happening after that? Well, maybe... Well, for one thing, I think queen f2 check will prevent the white king from getting back into play. So if nothing else, that looks like it could be pretty strong. But, yeah, I mean, just opening up the f-file in general looks like a mistake. Maybe queen takes f7 first should be played, but, yeah, I mean, black can stop white's king from getting home. So, funny enough, king takes e4, as crazy as this looks, is the best move. This way, the f-file stays closed, and after queen f7, rook h3, white is going to keep the f3 pawn protected, so that way white can then play king takes d3 and bring his king home. Black tried a6. Karpov again played accurately with queen g5. Now here, black had one really brilliant resource that would have kept some advantage. I don't think he's winning after it, but it's still definitely very dangerous for white. So that move here is e5, which is pretty remarkable. So the threat now is queen c4 check, king e3, and then bishop to f4 check. So that's kind of nasty. All right, so anyway, after that, rook takes g3 is the obvious move, and it's the best move. Knight c5, king e3, castles. And although white's up a full piece, obviously black is still doing quite well. I mean, black is objectively better here, but I don't know that it's a forced win or anything. So black still has to prove that there's a win, and I'm not sure that it's a win either. However, in the game after h6, queen e3, then e5, now white is surviving. Now the point of this little maneuver by black is that if rook takes g3, queen c4 check, and there's no king to e3, so the queen on e3, which retreated there, has cut off the king's escape. So king f5, castles, and then there's three mates in one. Rook f6, queen f7, and queen to e6. But of course, Karpov didn't bother taking the bishop. He played king takes d3, and the position is about equal now. White's up a pawn. His development's kind of poor, but his king is actually safe. It's just going back to c2. Black regained the pawn, but white was able to establish decent coordination here all of a sudden. And, yeah, I mean, it's not clear that the black king is any better off than white's king, really, especially after this. So now black's king is a bit safer, but white's king is completely safe. It's like he castled kingside style over on the queen side. And in fact now, with this great bishop on e4, white's even better, and he managed to eventually win the endgame. So kind of a remarkable game, certainly a visually appealing one, but Zaitsev had his chances. Okay, and one more question, or actually two questions. And this, yeah, it's kind of interesting. This is the first time I think, where it's rare on here that I have questions about GM games, and here I had no less than 3 or 4. Okay, well, finally we come to more traditional style questions, and they're both about the Caro-Kann, interestingly enough. So the first one is from, actually I don't remember which one was first in order, but we go through them both. So start with one from Chess Enthusiast, and this is about a variation in the advance. So bishop f5, knight c3, so this is the so-called Shirov variation. Here the most popular move is c5 rather than knight to e7, but okay, he asked me about knight to e7, so that's what I'll answer. h5, f5, ef5, g5. So Chess Enthusiast says, it's clear that the bishop is out of play for a while, but the computer thinks that this is okay for black. I would find it interesting to have some thoughts and explanations on the position. Thanks. Okay, well, it's hard to give any really super simple explanations because there are actually several variations that can be played here, and depending on what's chosen, the play will be quite a bit different. Now, the obvious point you already brought up: White wants to keep this bishop on g6 out of the game, preferably forever, really. Just turn this guy into an absolutely dreadful piece, a pawn, an unpromotable pawn, you might say. So to do that, of course, the plan is to drive this knight to f4 and essentially leave it there. And not only does it stop the f5-f4 break, but it hits h5. In some cases, it hits d5, because remember, black often wants to play c5, and it sometimes supports the e6 advance as well. So it's really very nicely placed there. Well, for black, I mean, he simply has to suffer with this bad piece for a while, but he hopes that his other trumps, traditional trumps, are going to save the day. Now, we can, I think, make a good stab at figuring out what black should play. But first, let me mention a couple of other possibilities. One move that's sometimes played here is knight to d7. Of course, white plays knight f4 and seems to be in good shape. Again, e6 may be on the agenda someday. Black can also, and has also, tried the kind of stereotyped c5. I mean, this is a standard idea for black in the Shirov variation, or against the Shirov variation of the advance variation of the Caro-Kann. But here, you know, it's certainly a bit risky. Again, the d5 pawn is loose, so after dc, let's say knight b to c6, a3, aiming to play b4 if necessary to keep that c5 pawn, knight e5 and bishop to g2. Well, you can see, I mean, this pawn on d5 is vulnerable. White can continue with knight f4 and put even more pressure on it, maybe play bishop to e3 first, so there's no d5, d4 advance. And I'll play b4 if need be to cement this, which keeps the bishop on e2 locked in, on f8 locked in, excuse me. And maybe another idea in some cases might be knight b5. But anyway, you can see that white certainly has some promising options. Of course, he doesn't get to make all these moves at once. Black certainly is in the game too. But it's certainly a very lively position, and black has to be very careful here. Well, based on what we've seen then, it would make sense for black to not be in a rush to play c5 and to be concerned about e6. Well, how can he control e6? The answer, knight a6, and then knight c7. And this is the main line of the variation. Okay, white generally plays h4 here, cementing the pawn on g5, knight e6, knight c to e2 to preserve a knight on f4. And now black has tried various moves. Queen to b6, he's tried queen to c7, and he's tried, I think, most commonly queen to d7. But anyway, we can leave the variation at this point. It gives at least a very cursory overview of some of the basic problems that both sides have to face in the position. All right, so that's Caro-Kann question number 1. Caro-Kann question number 2, e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c d5, c4, knight f6. Here, okay, this question is from Gooey Jim, and a little bit strangely, he says he gives knight f3. Knight c3 is a much more common move order. You know, sometimes you want to be careful about allowing this bishop to g4 pin. Now, I know there's a trick or so with allowing it, but still, knight f3 I think is not as accurate. Anyway, g6, knight c3. Here, of course, black can play knight to c6. This isn't bad either, but bishop g7 takes. Here, I think castling is maybe slightly more accurate, but okay, didn't ask about that either. Knight takes d5, bishop c4. Here, I think definitely more accurate is queen to b3. Okay, bishop c4. Here, definitely correct is knight to b6. Bishop to e6 is just a mistake. All right, queen to b3, knight c7, d5, bishop c8, castles, castles. And here, Gooey Jim says, white has a very visually pleasing game, but I went for an all-out attack and it failed here. What would you do in this position? Thanks. Well, let's kind of count our assets here. Well, of course, we have more space, we have better development, and well, what do we have any targets though? See, that's a question. So, yeah, we've got these assets, but they're both short-term assets for the most part. Space, that can be a long-term asset, but it's based on this d5 pawn, which is isolated, And so in a way, the space advantage is kind of a temporally based one as well, or at least potentially a temporary one, because if black can exert sufficient pressure on this D pawn, then I think he can be in pretty good shape. And certainly he can catch up in development. So white needs to strike while the iron is hot, or to engage in other activities that represent cliches, meaning that you should act quickly. So, well, again, what target does white have in the black position? The only thing that comes to mind really is this pawn on e7. I mean, this seems like a slight potential weakness, and it's certainly an area where we can try to ramp up the pressure a little bit. So, two moves come to mind: rook to e1 or bishop to g5. And I kind of like bishop to g5 best, at least that's my first thought. But it seems that black can play boldly but successfully, relatively speaking, with h6, and then if bishop to h4, g5. So this seems a bit much, but after knight to e8 followed by knight to d6, the advantage seems to have dissipated a bit. Say knight to d7, threatening to go to c5, queen a3. White is still better here, no question about it, but not as much better, certainly, as I think he should be. So instead of bishop to g5, let's try rook to e1. So it's less committal. We're not giving black any hits on the bishop. We would certainly love to play bishop to g5 next move, but if black plays h6, well, then we don't have to waste a tempo with our bishop going there. We can play something else. And rook e1 is useful in any case. So rook e1, I think, makes very good sense. Probably black's best is knight to d7. Okay, now bishop to g5. And one key point is that if rook to e8, d6 is just game over. So knight f6. And here I'm not really sure what white's best is. I mean, white has, again, a very comfortable position. But how to turn it into something further, I'm not sure. So certainly we can make some useful building moves. And I think there are several moves that would all be kind of nice to play. One move we'd like to play is h3, just to stop any bishop to g4 business. And the reason why we care about bishop to g4 is we might like to play rook a to d1, supporting our pawn and maybe in some cases supporting the d5, d6 advance. Secondly, we wouldn't mind playing a4 and maybe, if permitted, a5, so we don't have to worry about any dirty tricks with a6 and b5 undermining our pawn on d5. And a third thing we probably wouldn't mind playing is, instead of rook a to d1, I mean, that's not bad either, but rook a to c1 is also a possibility, just putting the rook on the open file. Maybe the bishop will come back to f4, and we'll start to have some tactical possibilities there as well. Okay, so what should we do with all this? I mean, so one idea would be to play h3 and continue with rook a to d1. Another idea is the prophylactic a4. Against this, black should probably make the blockade here with knight e8 and then knight to d6. And then finally, something like rook a to c8, a to c1, which is also a bit of a kind of high-class waiting move. So now we have bishop to g4, then we play knight to e5. Black has this interesting little shot a6, and on a4, b5. Knight to e5 is interesting also. So that way on b5, there are knight c6 tricks. Not right away, but that's certainly lurking. Anyway, after a4, b5, takes, knight b5, and now knight c takes d5. I mean, this looks really precarious for black, but there doesn't seem to be any way for white to really cash in and establish a winning advantage. So white is still better. For instance, takes, knight c7. So again, holding on to the pawn. I mean, here, white's position is very much for choice, but it isn't winning yet. Black still has some real fight left here. So I think, if in this position you just felt like your game was overwhelming, then it's easy to see how you can kind of go crazy and be disappointed by a loss. But really, I mean, I think white's advantages are much more precarious. So it's little things, a little more space right now, a little bit more development right now, and some pressure against e7. And but I don't think there's any immediate way to turn this into something concrete. I think you should just keep building, try to keep black in the box. That's what moves like h3 and a4 are all about. and only once you finished mobilizing and have done what you could to stop Black's possibilities, only then I think is a time to look for some knockout blows. All right. Well, with that, we are caught up on the viewer questions, and I hope you found them interesting and enlightening and entertaining as well. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.